Thanks. And, since Dennis did the heavy lifting in this project, I will just do kind of the mood music to start with, and then he will talk about the serious things. So, next slide. Okay. As we all know, we're the world or its people are consuming far too many resources, much more than the Earth is able to provide. So we're essentially depleting natural capital on a steady basis. And this is just one of the representations of that from the global footprint network. Well, so what that means is that consumers will certainly have to change their behavior in order to bring their consumption into line with the Earth's carrying capacity. And citizens will have to form their opinions on what government should do in order to set the right incentives or disincentives for sustainable consumption. So we strongly believe that consumers and citizens are kind of the pillar of this transition process, and they need to be studied in addition to the macroscopic processes like the larger structures in society and its institutions. So this is what we focus on. So essentially, in Switzerland, this raises very peculiar issues because not only are we over-consuming natural resources within the Swiss territory, it's very little, small territory of about 41,000 square kilometers and about 8 million people on it. We're also consuming a lot of the resources beyond the national territory. And this raises very interesting questions also for public opinion and consumer research, because essentially this makes it more complex to bring consumption on a sustainable trajectory, because as we all know, about 3/4 of the environmental footprint of Swiss consumption lies abroad, not within our national territory. So what we've been doing all along, we've been focusing on how do perceptions of voluntary environmental action by the private sector and policy design affect public support for policies to facilitate a green economy? And we're trying to understand public opinion formation in this regard, especially also with an angle to corporate environmental behavior, because there's kind of a very complex relationship between voluntary initiatives of the private public sector and the way the general public, meaning consumers and citizens, form their opinions about environmental measures that the government should or should not take in this area. In the ideal world, there should be synergies, like, government should set the right incentives, there should be voluntary action by corporations, and at the same time, this would encourage consumers and citizens to become greener. And so there would be kind of a ratcheting up process towards a greener society. In the worst case, there may be kind of a zero-sum game where if companies engage in voluntary action, citizens believe, well, that's fine, so let them do it, and we can continue as we used to do. So there are all kinds of dynamic processes that could go on. And what we did is, and this is the last slide I'm going to talk about, and then Dennis will take over. So essentially, we're talking about public support, acceptance of certain types of voluntary or public policy interventions in markets, because we all know that markets fail quite widely in this area, and such initiatives are needed to green the economy. So we're looking at prior attitudes of citizens, we're looking at policy designs, and basically, if you think about this as kind of a political Pareto optimization process, what we want to achieve is policy interventions that are both environmentally effective and politically acceptable, because essentially you need both. If you fail on one end, it's not going to get us where we want to get. And corporate behavior also plays an important role. So as already signaled here, I think it has worked very well. So far, our research, we've done quite a lot of public opinion surveys, survey experiments in studying citizens' consumer attitudes and behavior. Dennis actually finished his dissertation. He did so really with flying colors. I have to say this up front. I've rarely had a dissertation where four of the four papers were already published in high impact journals, as you see, like Global Environmental Change, and also another one, Ecological Economics. So 4 journal publications out by the time he defended his dissertation, and another one with a good journal in the pipeline. So this is really, in my view, a very, very impressive achievement, which shows that these NRP programs are not just about kind of funding applied research that sometimes people in Division 1 look down upon. So it can really fund, high level, high caliber dissertation work, which really makes it into very good journals. So I'm very proud of Dennis, I have to say here. And the work will not stop here. We are still in the field with a large survey. Dennis will mention it. And also, as you might know, my group runs the Swiss Environmental Panel together with BAFU, which is unfortunately not here today. So we poll about 5,000 to 10,000 citizens, a very high quality sample in Switzerland twice a year. And wave 8 of the environmental panel will be on sustainable consumption and the circular economy. We're already engaged now in working out the survey instruments with BAFU on this. So with this, Dennis, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you, Thomas, for this kind introduction. So some of the projects we already presented to the NRP audience at previous conferences. So today, what I'm going to do is I'll give you a deeper insight on one of our projects, which we have not yet presented to a wide NRP 73 audience. Before then, I'll talk you through some of the main takeaways of our project really in a nutshell, and give you an outlook over our current research activities, which Thomas already touched upon. So the name of the article I'm going to elaborate on a bit is Citizen Preferences on Private-Public Co-Regulation in Environmental Governance, Evidence from Switzerland. And Thomas and I co-authored the article with our colleague from LMU Munich, Lucas Rudolph, and the article has been published in Global Environmental Change. So the motivation for our study here is that public-private cooperation in environmental governance has become more and more common. And while many of these initiatives are international, very broad in scope, as you know, like the UN Global Compact, many sector-specific, but still very influential initiatives, like, for example, the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles in Germany, and there are similar examples in Switzerland exist as well. Now, the main sort of theoretical argument underlying these governance hybrids is that governmental efforts can improve on efficiency if corporations are involved, as long as their shirking incentives can be kept in check. And there is a theoretical blueprint from the literature on how to manage environmental commons, which suggests that there's like 3 main elements to that. So we have transparency, so there must be some kind of mandatory disclosure of information, monitoring, so some control of that information, and at the end of the day, a regulatory threat, by which I mean a trigger to increase government competences to introduce rules top-down if a more collaborative approach turns out to be ineffective. So while in theory we know how a governance hybrid should look like, actually what policy design citizens would support is not so obvious, because we don't know how citizens trade off inclusiveness of policy decisions with the extent of government oversight and, of course, accountability aspects as well for the outcomes of the policy itself. And therefore, we investigate the question that just popped on. So, like, what policy designs in public-private co-regulation are citizens actually willing to support, and why? So we did that using a so-called conjoint survey experiment. So this is a choice experiment in which participants are shown 2 alternatives that they have to weigh against each other. Now, these 2 policy alternatives, they are randomly composed of sort of certain expressions on 4, in our case, 4 different attributes, and I'll get to those in a second. So folks would see a table like that, and they would be asked to indicate their preference with a choice task at the very bottom of the table. Each respondent would be asked to do these 5 different times. Now, in this experimental setup, the decision attribute that we've seen before operationalizes sort of the inclusiveness of the decision making. So it ranges from firms and parliament deciding in an isolated way up to more inclusive designs where all major societal stakeholders are on board. The other three dimensions, they map the extent of government oversight of what corporations do, and they are based on the theory from the commons literature I talked about before. So the transparency refers to the type of reporting that is required. The monitoring indicates who checks that reporting. And finally, with the regulatory threat, I'm referring to the, sort of the trigger point at which government competences to introduce more rigid rules top-down that go beyond just transparency kick in. So in our experiment, respondents were randomly assigned to one of two environmental contexts to make this a bit more realistic. And these were, on the one hand, the financial sector and the effect of its investments on climate change. And the other one was the effect of pesticide use in agriculture on biodiversity and water quality, which is also a somewhat timely topic. So I will show you some of the results now. I'm not going to go in the weeds, but I think it would be nice to have some general idea how the results look like. So the x-axis on this graph shows the average choice probability across all policy combinations, so the columns that you've seen before, in which a specific dimension level, which you see on the left, on the y-axis, was presented. So overall, we observe a preference in favor of extensive co-regulation. So what does that mean? So we see that respondents demand public reporting, they demand rather sophisticated monitoring provisions, and they were in favor of having a sort of regulatory trigger rather earlier than later. However, what we also, if we look at the same metric for the decision dimension, we observe that people have also a distaste for isolated decision making, be it by firms but also by parliament, and instead they really prefer the policy design process to be more inclusive. So if we sort of sum up, right? So in terms of policy design, we know, okay, we've seen citizens support extensive government control of corporate activities. However, there's something else we found in the article, which I did not present here due to time constraints, and it was the following. So the support for these kind of extensive government oversight provisions is conditional on the decision-making process. So if it is inclusive of other societal stakeholders, citizens are happy to live with a smaller government role. Now, that could be bad news for democratic accountability, because we also found that citizens tend to perceive elected representatives less responsible for the eventual outcome of inclusive policy processes. Now, I will now return to the other two blocks that we've just showed you on the previous slide, and just give you some of the other main findings of our work. So with regard to attitudes, we show that it is actually quite important what individuals what mindset or beliefs they hold about how firms take decisions in terms of how then people form policy preferences in environmental governance. And finally, with regard to corporate behavior, we find that if firms engage in environmental action, citizens are not only willing to reward those firms with their consumer loyalty, which has been shown by a plethora of studies, but they're also willing to reward those firms with political benefits, such as, for example, tax breaks. However, we also show that the voluntary environmental action by firms can reduce public support for regulation, while accusations of greenwashing cannot sort of counteract that, right? So once firms commit, they have sort of quite a sort of strong incentive to maintain that environmental action and coordinate that, so to reduce regulatory pressures. Okay, so our project, as mentioned before, is not quite over yet, and I would like to give you a brief outlook to the final couple of months and what we're going to do. So some may have seen us present some of our previous work on public opinion on supply chains and the regulation thereof in earlier meetings. Now, since supply chains and the regulation thereof is such a key dimension of progressing towards more sustainable economic activity And since it is not only a policy priority in Switzerland, but also in Europe, we decided to revisit that topic. So specifically as our final activity, we want to implement a multi-country public opinion survey on policy preferences concerning supply chain and supply chain regulations. We think we can fill an important gap in policy terms because most of our current work is narrowly focused on Switzerland. And, in this context, the debate on the Responsible Business Initiative. But we would like to make claims also to what extent our work travels beyond the Swiss border and how the sort of aggregate preferences regarding policy designs of government intervention in supply chains form elsewhere as well. But we also think we can do a real academic contribution here because we can, this gives us the opportunity to dive into the question, okay, what factors actually drive this political demand for government intervention in supply chain we seem to observe. So we could sort of assess whether this is an expression of a backlash against economic globalization, or whether it is more of a demand for domestic consumer protection, or if at the end of the day, this mainly moral considerations drive public support, or whether it's a combination of some of these, could be as well, of course. Now, so this should help us to get an idea of how political coalitions form on the micro level on these economic globalization issue. So we could, for example, also probe whether individuals align across along traditional political spectra, think of like the left-right scale, or whether there's actually more important dimensions to that if we aim to understand public support. Okay, so this was a brief overview of where we're going to go next. We are looking forward to this research. This was a very brief presentation of our project. There's a lot more to discuss, but I'll stop here. And I thank you for having me, and thank you for